fire off a starting question, and we'll take it from there. Can we have a round of applause,
Well, thanks very much, Carl, and thanks to all of you for coming. If I had the power, there's one word I would like to ban, and it's a word that Carl, who's usually very articulate, it's a word that he used twice in his introduction, and the word was interrogate. And to me, interrogate reminds us of a whole era where many of us had very nasty experiences gathering. I kept listening to you gather. And also, I think there's another word which does much better than interrogate, and that is to question. So think about using that word. But people, I think we thank you, Adam, also for coming and agreeing to talk to us. I think that we should be very proud of having a Vice-Chancellor who is also a public intellectual and who is not afraid of speaking truth to power. Who is even not afraid to call the ruling party, and he's the head of a state institution, he's not afraid to call the ruling party a grubby instrument of enrichment. That says something about who Adam is and who he has been for a very long time. So far, I don't see any evidence of power changing or corrupting him. But of course, we must watch him closely for that. Now, there's a lot of intellectual courage in this book. And what I especially liked, can you hear me at the back, by the way? What I especially liked is his attempt to deal with an alternative political agenda, to deal with solutions. Because many of us get stuck at the much safer level of denunciation. Having said that word of praise, I can now move on to putting the knife in. And I'm going to ask just three questions, and they're questions which relate very directly both to Adam's book and to the National Development Program. And they're questions that are really a challenge for all of us, because the question behind those three is this one. How do we understand our society? And how do you understand your place in that society? The first question I want to put to Adam, and we'll stop after each question, Carl, if that's all right, so we have a chance, and then open it up for discussion at the end. The first question I want to put, which I think is right at the center of the book, concerns your analysis of the balance of power in South Africa at the moment. How power is distributed, how it is exercised, and by whom. And my question is whether your analysis of the balance of forces, of power relations, supports your argument for the viability of a social pact, a pact between business, labor, and the state. And your argument, as I understand it, is that there were attempts to establish such a pact in the 1990s, but they failed. And they failed, in Adam's view, because the balance of power between unions and the corporate sector was too unequal. But, Adam argues, this has now changed very substantially. The 2007 ANC conference at Polokwane ushered in a new era, I'm quoting. And as a result, the inequality in leverage between business and labor has been overcome. There's now what he calls a relative parity. Now, I find this an extraordinary claim. And it's extraordinary whether we think abstractly in terms of increasing class polarization, the increasing antagonism between the political and economic elites and the growing number of the marginalized. It's an extraordinary claim, I think, if we talk concretely about any number of issues, such as labor broking or e-tolling or the youth wage subsidy. So my first question to Adam is, how can you substantiate this claim about the relative parity between capital and labor?
Colleagues, thank you very much. It's a wonderful opportunity to have this possibility of engaging Jackie in this conversation. You know, I want to make one introductory comment to the book. And somebody asked me the other day, how would you describe this book? And I said, the answer is, if you like, how the hell did we get in the mess we're in? And how do we think about getting out of the mess we're in? And that's largely what the book tries to do. It doesn't suggest that everything is bad. It actually suggests that South Africa today is a far better place than we've ever been. But it suggests that we made some big mistakes in 1994, and some of those mistakes are now coming to haunt us. And the only way out of this is if we can look and explore the possibility of some pact between social forces. Now, this is not an extraordinary position today, because actually a number of commentators have been making this point for a number of years, and in fact the National Development Plan makes the case for it quite extensively. Let me kick off by answering Jackie's question by saying, how do pacts happen? And one of the things that I think is really tragic in South Africa is that as we started talking about the pacts, we very rarely looked at comparative cases in the developing world where pacts happen and said, why did they happen in those cases? And one of the things that I found particularly persuasive is a set of studies that looked at why pacts happen in Southern Europe and Latin America. And the argument was that effectively pacts tend to happen in a particular structural condition. That pacts happen when elites are worried enough that they can't get their own way in the traditional set of operations, and that what they need to do is rethink how to move forward with resolving the issue of the pact. So elites very rarely establish a pact because they're feeling strong. They very rarely establish a pact because it's in the national interest. They establish a pact when they think they're going to lose the whole shop. And in that context, they look for a solution. And normally what that structural condition is, a relative balance of power. A relative balance of power. So in Latin America, when military elites felt they were in trouble, when they felt that they didn't have enough ability to get rid of social organizations like trade unions, etc., what they did is they tried to establish a state corporatism program. In Western Europe, for a long period of time, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, when confronted with the rise of the Soviet Union, when confronted with the prospects of a Cold War, when confronted with the resurgent trade union movement in large parts of Scandinavia and other parts of the continent, they began to look towards the possibility of a pact. And the pact began to become this thing. So the question was, if you look at that kind of condition, did that pact prevail in South Africa, and particularly in the 1990s? Now, I think a lot of those within the union movement and those in the academy supportive of the union movement felt that the possibility of a relative power, parity of power existed in the 1990s. And I've argued for a long time that they were wrong. That effectively we didn't have that. That yes, in 1994, we had the broad emergence of a stalemate at the political level. But as in the 1990s, as we began to unravel the apartheid state, simultaneously, a whole series of things were happening on the economic front, which worked in exactly the opposite direction, both globally and locally. Globally, the ability of capital to become more mobile, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the delegitimization of state economic projects, and all of that weakened the union and radical movements economic project. And in that context, there wasn't a parity of power. There was a parity of power at the political level, but not at the economic level, and in a sense, the pact unraveled. Now that doesn't mean we didn't have the institutions towards the pact. We had the NEDLACs, etc. But in reality, the NEDLACs didn't deal with the real substance of the questions. They dealt with the marginal questions. And its great success story was the Labour Relations Act in 1996. But other than that, they dealt with the small issues. The biggest legislation in the mid-1990s that had a fundamental impact on our development, which was the gear strategy, never got to the pact. It never got to NEDLAC. In fact, it was decided at cabinet level, and it was then, even the ANC, frankly, hadn't seen it until after the event. And so that, in a sense, demonstrated the weakness of the union movement in that context. And the union movement have, and people within the ANC have been protesting this for a number of periods. And you saw that manifest itself in the treatment action campaign struggles, in the labor struggles that took place, and then particularly in the succession struggles that happened from 2005 with Jacob Zuma and Thabo Mbeki. I do think 2007 was different, however. And it might not seem it from 2013. But in 2008, particularly because COSATU played such a phenomenal role, and the Youth League played such a phenomenal role in bringing Jacob Zuma to power, I do think that it changed quite dramatically the balance of power in the society. And there's a number of indications of this. One of the most striking things I often find is ask kind of left-leaning political analysts the kinds of invitations they got after 2008. One of the most fascinating things that I found is until 2007, frankly, the only people who'd bother listening to me is a bunch of lefties and a bunch of activists in the social movements. From 2008, I received invitations from every major company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, largely to speak to their boards. And by the way, it wasn't only me. If you speak to every public analyst of one form or the other, largely left-leaning ones, they began to start getting all kinds of invitations. And what was interesting in those conversations was the questions they were asking. It was the question, you could see that 2007, at least the Polokwane conference in 2007, had unsettled big business in quite significant ways. I had invitations from a bank who said to me, can you rethink, can you talk to us about how banks can service poor communities? It was quite striking. It asked the question in 2008, not in 2005 or 2000 or 1994. And suddenly, there was a whole series of measures that said, could we begin to look towards a kind of alternative? I think we saw it manifested in multiple other ways. We saw it manifested in some of the appointments that came into the cabinet. Ibrahim Patel, Rob Davies, and a whole range of others who came in from COSATU and other left-leaning circles, partly to advance. If you look at some of our actual programs, the New Growth Path is largely a shift, a social democratic program in quite significant ways. By the way, even the National Development Plan and the critique of the National, if you compare the National Development Plan to GEAR in 1996, it's a fundamental shift. I think that those in the trade union movement who say that it's the same thing. Now, I think there's some big mistakes in the National Development Plan, and I can talk about that in a while. But I think it's not the same as GEAR. I think that there is a significant shift. It is much more interventionist than GEAR was. It is much less reliant on the market. It has a much more industrialized, a plan at the heart of it, an industrialized plan at the heart of it. So, in a lot of ways, I promise you I'm coming to an end. So the question is, I do think there's been a shift. And I will end at this point where I think it doesn't seem like, because when you look at some of the tensions and fracturing of COSATU, you think that there's a real potential that this is going to erode. But the fact that in the last couple of years, 2 years, we've had the kinds of strikes we had, and we've had the kinds of unsettling effects that we had, suggest that it is far more, the unions are far more influential in economic terms than they were in 1996 and 1997. Sorry, I'll stop.
But thanks, Adam. You know, Adam, in all fairness, the question I put to you was whether your analysis holds up. The question was whether your analysis of the changing balance of power supports your argument for the viability of a social pact between capital labor and the state. And I was absolutely, of course there's been a shift, but a shift does not mean that there's now this relative parity that you refer to. But we're going to come back to this, because I do see it as central both to your book and to the National Development Plan. Now, my second question is about inequality. And it seems to me that we still have, despite a good deal of protesting, loud protesting voices, we still have excessive corporate executive salaries. We learned last week that the CEO of Sasol, his remuneration was increased to 53 million for this year. And there should be a gasp of horror from this audience. But we're getting brutalized. We accept these things. I hope the next piece of information I'm going to give you will evoke a gasp of anger, indignation. And that is, I heard this week that the Saxon Hotel has introduced a new, what they call a tasting menu. I've never been to such an event, but apparently you have something like 8 courses and wonderful wines, and the price per head at the Saxon Hotel for one meal, admittedly very grand, very filling, or maybe the portions are tiny, so it's not so filling, but the price per head is 4,900 rand. And I'm pleased I did hear some that's what I was waiting for. The point is that we still have extravagant consumption, we still have deepening inequalities. So much so that I often think of a comment Warren Buffett made a few years ago. He said, of course there's a class war underway, and of course my class, the rich class, is winning. In terms of Adam's answer, and you know, social pacts often do emerge from what Huntington has called hurting stalemates, I see no sense of capital hurting. Now, rising inequality, Adam, is something that concerns you. But I'm going to be a bit nasty here, I'm afraid. You write, CEOs and senior executives in the corporate sector enjoy overly extravagant remuneration packages. But, you go on to say, and I'm quoting, quote, some symbol of sacrifice from the political and economic elite is required. When the elite are perceived to be recipients of such lavish excess, not only does it prevent the management of popular expectations, but it also provokes ordinary citizens to demand more. Now, this seems to me to come very close to reducing inequality, an issue of social justice, an issue of survival for the almost half of our people who live in poverty. This seems to reduce inequality to a public relations exercise, something which requires symbolic change so that we can manage popular expectations, rather than social justice and a substantive redistribution of wealth and resources. So my question to you, Adam, is can we have an honest conversation about reducing inequality without talking about redistribution? And we could link to that, in your view, does the NDP go far enough in setting its objective of reducing the Gini coefficient to 0.6 by 2030?
I think that's a fair point, right? Let me kick off, because it's related to the other issue. Let me kick off by the subtext of what the book is about. the subtext of the book is that we're not in a revolution any further. And the possibility of getting revolution is not on the cards. And if it was possible to get revolution, then the fundamental issue of justice would be on the table. A much more radical redistributive agenda. And that's the subtext of it. Now, we have two options.